Something happened today that most analysts are completely missing. Iran's top military general stood in front of cameras and said, and I quote, "There is no room for retreat." Meanwhile, Donald Trump is sitting on a plane to Beijing. The ceasefire he brokered is, in his own words, on life support. And right now, as you watch this video, Israeli forces have crossed the Litani River in Lebanon, a boundary they were never supposed to cross under the ceasefire agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not watching a peace process. We are watching a war that the United States and Israel started on February 28th, and which nobody, not Trump, not Netanyahu, not Tehran, knows how to end. Today is May 13th, 2026, day 74 of this conflict. And today I'm going to walk you through exactly what is happening, why the ceasefire is on the verge of collapse, what Iran's military posture tells us about the next phase of this war, and why Trump flying to China right now might be the most consequential diplomatic gamble of this entire conflict. Stay with me. This is going to be a detailed breakdown, and every single fact I give you today is sourced, verified, and current as of this morning. Let me first give everyone, including those who are new to this channel, a clear picture of what led us to this moment. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury. In just 12 hours, they carried out nearly 900 coordinated airstrikes targeting Iranian military infrastructure, air defenses, missile systems, and government buildings. But this wasn't just a military operation. It was also a political assassination campaign. Within the first 30 minutes of the strikes, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. 3 separate gatherings of Iranian regime officials were hit within half a minute of each other. The operation had been planned for months, with what the IDF described as strategic and operational deception, deliberately manipulating satellite imagery so Iran would not see the attack coming. Now, I want you to think about what that means for a moment. This was not a warning shot. This was not a message. This was a full-scale attempt to decapitate the Iranian government in a single night. The Iranian response was immediate and massive. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched at Israel, at U.S. military bases across the region, and at U.S. allied Arab states including Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Iran also closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes. This single act sent shockwaves through global energy markets that we are still feeling today. By early March, the conflict had expanded far beyond Iran itself. Hezbollah and Lebanon began exchanging fire with Israel in what has now been called the 2026 Lebanon War. More than 2,000 civilians and militants have been killed there alone. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest airports on the planet, was struck by Iranian drones and had to temporarily halt all flights. Saudi Arabia, in a development that was largely kept secret until recently, launched its own covert strikes on Iran in late March, according to Reuters. And then, a ceasefire of sorts was announced, but this ceasefire was fragile from the very beginning. As of today, 74 days into the conflict, the ceasefire is not holding. And the signs of its imminent collapse are everywhere. Now let's talk about today specifically, because today has been extraordinarily eventful. Development number 1, Iran says it will not back down. Iranian Brigadier General Mohammad Akrami Nia appeared on state media this morning and made a statement that should be headline news everywhere. He said Iran's military is maintaining, and I'm quoting directly here, the highest level of readiness, and that there is no room for retreat. Think about what that means in the current context. We have a so-called ceasefire. We have U.S.-Iran negotiations supposedly ongoing, and Iran's military leadership is publicly stating, on the record, that they are not retreating, they are not standing down, and they are fully prepared for whatever comes next. This is not the language of a side that is about to sign a peace deal. Development number 2, Lebanon is burning again. Today, Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon killed at least 12 people, including a mother and her 2 children. Israeli forces have also crossed the Litani River in southern Lebanon this week, a boundary that was explicitly part of the ceasefire agreement. The United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, reported today that multiple Hezbollah drones have struck their bases in recent days. UNIFIL has urged both sides to stop operating near their positions. When UN peacekeepers are getting hit by drones, that is not a ceasefire. That is a war with a ceasefire label on it. Since the ceasefire took effect on April 17th, Lebanon's health ministry has reported at least 380 people killed and over 100 injured. Let that number sink in. That is the death toll after the ceasefire was declared. Development number 3, Netanyahu's secret UAE visit. This was confirmed today by Netanyahu's own office. The Israeli Prime Minister secretly traveled to the UAE and met with UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed during the war. The visit was hidden from public view while it was happening. Now, why does this matter? Because the United States has been pressing Gulf Arab states to take sides. Just yesterday, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee publicly called on Arab states in the Persian Gulf to, quote, pick a side between Israel and Iran. Netanyahu's secret visit to the UAE suggests that behind-the-scenes diplomatic alignment is happening in ways that go far beyond what is being reported publicly. Development number 4, the war cost jumps again. The Pentagon confirmed today that the Iran war has now cost the United States $29 billion. This is an increase from the $25 billion figure they provided to Congress just 2 weeks ago. In other words, in 14 days, the cost increased by $4 billion. But here's the number that really matters. A war budgeting expert at Harvard Kennedy School told CNN in April that the true total cost to U.S. taxpayers could reach $1 trillion when you factor in equipment repair over 4 to 5 years, restocking high-tech weapon systems, and long-term care for the approximately 55,000 U.S. troops currently deployed in the region who may be exposed to various hazards. $1 trillion. For a war that has no clear end in sight? Development number 5, Trump's explosive statement. Today, President Trump said something that has left many Americans stunned. When asked about the economic impact of the Iran war on American families, the rising fuel costs, inflation, surging diesel prices, Trump said, "I don't think about Americans' financial situation when negotiating with Iran." I'll let you process that. A sitting U.S. president, whose war has driven diesel prices up 60% in a single year, who is presiding over inflation running at 3.8%, the highest since 2023, said publicly that he doesn't think about Americans' financial situation. That statement alone tells you something important about the political dynamics driving this war. And it tells you something about how much further this conflict might escalate before anyone in Washington decides the cost is too high. Now I want to spend some time on what I consider to be the central illusion of the past few weeks, the idea that there is, or ever was, a genuine ceasefire in this conflict. Let me be very direct. What has been called a ceasefire in this war is not a ceasefire in any meaningful sense of the word. A real ceasefire means both sides stop fighting, both sides pull back, both sides respect a defined boundary. None of that has happened here. Here is what has actually occurred since the so-called ceasefire was declared. Lebanon has seen 380 people killed. Israeli forces have crossed the Litani River, a defined red line under the ceasefire agreement. Hezbollah has attacked UNIFIL positions with drones. The U.S. Navy has fired on Iranian oil tankers, trying to move through its blockade. Iran has attempted a military infiltration of Kuwait. 4 IRGC members were arrested on May 1st on Bubiyan Island. The UAE has shot down Iranian drones, twice, in recent days. And Iran has continued to broadcast threats about the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a ceasefire. This is a conflict in which the major ground offensives have paused, but the underlying war continues on multiple fronts simultaneously. Why does this matter? Because the framing of ceasefire creates a false expectation that a peace deal is close. It leads to media coverage that downplays the ongoing violence, and it allows both governments to claim they are pursuing diplomacy while continuing to fight. Now let's look at the actual negotiations, because what's happening in the talks is just as revealing as what's happening on the battlefield. The United States put forward a proposal that centered on 2 core demands. Iran must agree not to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels, and Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran responded with a counter-proposal. According to Iranian state media, Tehran's counter-proposal included recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, compensation for war damages, the release of frozen Iranian assets, the lifting of sanctions, and an end to fighting on all fronts, including Lebanon. Notably, Iran's counter-proposal apparently said nothing about the nuclear program. Trump's response? He called Iran's counter-proposal totally unacceptable and described the ceasefire as being on life support. Here is the analytical problem with the American position. The United States went to war at a cost that may ultimately reach $1 trillion, with 3 stated objectives: destroy Iran's ballistic missile program, end Iran's support for regional proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Now, 74 days later, the negotiations have narrowed to just one of those 3 objectives: uranium enrichment. According to multiple Israeli sources who spoke to CNN, the missiles and the proxies are, and I'm quoting, probably off the table, as they do not appear to be included in early diplomatic drafts. Israel is alarmed by this. Israeli sources have told CNN that they fear Trump may strike a deal with Iran that leaves Tehran's nuclear program partially intact while ignoring the ballistic missile threat and the proxy networks that Iran has used to wage war across the region for decades. A deal that only addresses uranium enrichment, without dealing with missiles and proxies, would, from Israel's perspective, mean the war achieved very little of strategic value, and yet that appears to be exactly the kind of deal that is being discussed. Now let's turn to what I consider the most significant diplomatic development of this week: Donald Trump's visit to Beijing. Trump left Washington on Tuesday and is currently in China for meetings with President Xi Jinping. This trip was originally planned to focus on U.S.-China trade and economic relations, but the Iran war has completely overshadowed those goals. The core question Trump is raising with Xi is this: can China pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and agree to a peace deal? Beijing is being described as a potential mediator. Iran's ambassador to China has said so publicly. And from a purely logical standpoint, China has more leverage over Iran than almost any other country. China is one of Iran's largest oil customers and trading partners. If Beijing tells Tehran that continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz is damaging Chinese economic interests, that carries real weight. But here's the complication. China has its own interests in this situation, and they are not necessarily aligned with Washington's. First, a weakened United States, bogged down in an expensive Middle Eastern war with rising inflation and a distracted foreign policy, is not entirely unwelcome to Beijing. Second, China has been watching this conflict very carefully as a test case for how the United States uses military force against countries that challenge its regional dominance. The lessons China draws from this war will directly inform its calculations about Taiwan and the South China Sea. Third, China's official position has been to call for a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution while avoiding taking sides. That positioning gives Beijing maximum flexibility. They can present themselves as the indispensable peacemaker, which enhances their global standing, without making any concrete commitments. So what will come of the Trump-Xi summit on Iran? My assessment is this: China will offer general encouragement for diplomacy. Xi may agree to use China's influence to encourage Iran toward a deal. But China will not put any hard pressure on Iran that would damage their bilateral relationship. And they will certainly not agree to enforce U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil, which would be the one thing that might genuinely change Tehran's calculations. In other words, Trump will likely leave Beijing with positive-sounding statements about Chinese cooperation, but no concrete commitments that change the strategic situation on the ground. There is also a deeper irony here that I think deserves to be stated plainly. The United States spent the better part of a decade trying to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern oil and trying to contain Chinese influence in the region. And yet here we are, with the U.S. fighting an expensive war in the Middle East while simultaneously flying to Beijing to ask China to help clean up the mess. If Beijing wanted a demonstration of American strategic overextension, they couldn't have designed a better one. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who is traveling with Trump on this trip, told lawmakers that the Pentagon has plans for both escalation and de-escalation. When asked directly about the long-term strategy, Hegseth said, and I want you to pay attention to exactly what he said, "We have a plan to escalate if necessary. We have a plan to retrograde if necessary. We have a plan to shift assets." That is not a strategy. That is a menu of options. A real strategy tells you which option you are pursuing and why. What Hegseth described is the language of an administration that has not yet made a fundamental decision about where this war goes next. Meanwhile, the war continues. The cost continues to rise, and the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. The global economic consequences of that closure are severe and worsening. The International Energy Agency issued a stark warning this week. Global oil reserves are being drawn down at a record pace as countries that import Middle Eastern oil confront supply disruptions that have no precedent in modern history. Oil prices remain above $100 a barrel. The U.S. Department of Energy has said prices will likely stay there for weeks. Analysts warn that average U.S. gasoline prices could hit $5 a gallon. Diesel, the fuel that powers the trucks, trains, and tractors that move America's food supply, has jumped 60% in a single year and is now at $5.66 a gallon. This is not an abstraction. This is real economic pain being felt by real American families. Every dollar of that pain is a direct consequence of the decision to launch Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. And yet, the president says he doesn't think about Americans' financial situation when he negotiates with Iran. Let me now give you what I think are the three most likely scenarios for how this conflict develops over the next 30 to 60 days. Scenario 1, a narrow nuclear deal. This is currently the most likely outcome based on where the negotiations appear to be heading. Under this scenario, the U.S. and Iran reach a limited agreement focused on uranium enrichment. Iran agrees to cap enrichment below weapons-grade levels. In exchange, the U.S. agrees to partial sanctions relief, the release of some frozen assets, and a formal end to hostilities. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. Oil prices fall. Trump claims victory. Iran claims it survived the war with its nuclear program essentially intact. Who wins in this scenario? Arguably Iran, because they have protected their most strategic asset, their nuclear program, while the U.S. spent $29 billion and got almost none of its original stated objectives. Who loses? Israel, which went to war to eliminate multiple Iranian threats and ends up with a deal that addresses only one of them. Scenario 2. Ceasefire collapse and renewed conflict. This scenario becomes more likely with every passing day that the ceasefire holds in name only while violence continues on the ground. Under this scenario, a major incident, a significant Iranian missile strike on a U.S. base, or a large-scale Israeli offensive in Lebanon, or an IRGC attack on a Gulf Arab state, breaks the ceasefire irreparably. The U.S. resumes large-scale airstrikes on Iran. Iran responds with another wave of missiles and drones. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed indefinitely. This scenario would be catastrophic for the global economy. Oil at 150 a barrel or higher, a U.S. recession, regional instability spreading potentially to Pakistan, Turkey, and beyond. The probability of this scenario increases if Trump's China trip produces no concrete results, if Iran's internal hardliners gain the upper hand over any faction willing to negotiate, or if Israel takes unilateral action against Iranian proxies that drags the U.S. back in. Scenario 3, a comprehensive deal, the long shot. This scenario involves a deal that goes beyond uranium enrichment to address missiles, proxies, and regional security architecture. This is what the U.S. originally said it wanted. This is what would give Israel a sense that the war achieved something. But this scenario requires Iran to make concessions it has so far refused to make, and it requires the U.S. to offer Iran something significant in return, potentially full sanctions relief and security guarantees. Given the current state of the negotiations, this scenario seems unlikely in the near term. But it cannot be entirely ruled out if back-channel diplomacy is more advanced than what is publicly known. My honest assessment, Scenario 1 is most likely, Scenario 2 is dangerously close to Scenario 1 in probability, and Scenario 3 is a distant third. The critical variable, the thing that will determine which of these paths we go down, is what happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks of negotiations. And specifically, whether Iran is willing to accept a deal that doesn't give them everything they've asked for, and whether Trump is willing to accept a deal that doesn't give him everything he originally claimed to be fighting for. Let me close with something I think gets lost in the daily flood of news updates and breaking developments. This war, whatever its ultimate outcome, has already changed the world in permanent ways. The assassination of Ali Khamenei on February 28th was an event without precedent in modern history. No U.S. president had ever authorized the killing of a foreign head of state in living memory in this manner. Whatever the justification, that act has set a precedent that will reverberate for decades. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has demonstrated that a single regional power, if sufficiently desperate, can hold the global economy hostage. That lesson has not been lost on other countries watching this conflict. The $29 billion spent so far, and the $1 trillion that experts say this will ultimately cost, represents a massive diversion of American resources from domestic needs, from infrastructure, from healthcare, from the economic security of ordinary American families, and the political consequences are already becoming visible. This war is unpopular at home. It is threatening Republican prospects in the November midterms. Trump's statement that he doesn't think about Americans' financial situation is not just politically damaging, it reveals a fundamental disconnect between the decision makers and the people who bear the costs of those decisions. I've been analyzing global conflicts for a long time, and what strikes me most about this one is not its military dimensions, which are dramatic, but its fundamental strategic incoherence. The United States went to war with stated objectives that it appears unable or unwilling to achieve. It has spent an enormous amount of money, generated an enormous amount of regional instability, and may end up with a deal that its own ally Israel considers inadequate. That is not a success story. That is a cautionary tale. And the story is not over. That is my full analysis for today, May 13th, 2026, day 74 of the Iran-US war. If you found this breakdown useful, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who are looking for serious, sourced analysis rather than sensationalism. Subscribe if you haven't already. I publish detailed breakdowns like this one regularly, and every video is built on verified sources, not speculation, not clickbait. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Do you think a deal is coming? Or are we heading back to full-scale war? Tell me what you think. I'll see you in the next one.